Talk now to our correspondent, our diplomatic correspondent, Paul Adams, who's following the twists and turns for us inside the summit venue itself. I mean, they couldn't be any more clear here, could they, Paul? What they're talking about is Afghanistan in terms of Afghanistan being NATO's most ambitious project ever.
It certainly is. It's the biggest mission that the NATO has ever undertaken. It is also, of course, the first out-of-area, as they say, operation conducted by NATO, well beyond the confines of the original, if you like, the original parameters of NATO as a European defence and security organisation. And that's why one of the things being discussed today is a new strategic concept, a project that will be launched at this summit, which will take about a year to draw up, and will essentially ask the question, in these different times that we live in, what is NATO for? The last strategic concept was drawn up in 1999 and hasn't been amended since, and clearly the world is a very different place from the world that existed in 1999. So there is a strong feeling that the whole strategic underpinning and conceptual underpinning of NATO needs to be looked at again. So that will be one of the outcomes of this summit. But as you say, the morning's proceedings very much devoted to a discussion of the operation in Afghanistan, a general acknowledgement that it's not going as well as people had hoped and wished for. The Americans have taken a good, long, hard look at the operation. They've found it wanting in all sorts of key regards, and they've also cast it in a more regional context, making the very obvious point that you cannot deal in isolation with Afghanistan without also thinking about the situation across the border in Pakistan. And it is that new vision of the mission in Afghanistan that President Obama has been presenting to his NATO colleagues in the hope that they will offer more to help the mission turn around.
Paul, thanks very much. Mr. Brown starting his news conference with his line that assurances have to be a reality, a reference there to the law signed into place by the Afghan President Hamid Karzai, affecting a very small minority of women in Afghanistan. Critics of the law saying it was in effect a right for men to rape women within marriage. That wasn't centre stage in the debate going on at NATO. It certainly has occupied a lot of the debating time. Gordon Brown telling us, however, liberties have to be protected, and he's been having a conversation with the Afghan President Hamid Karzai, who's told him that law will be returned to Parliament. Our continuing coverage goes on.
But from now really till October, to make sure that the democracy of Afghanistan is maintained, to make sure particularly that the Taliban don't get any credibility from disrupting the election, and that's why countries have been prepared to announce today the additional efforts they're making. David, do you want to add to that?
I'll just add one thought to that, and that's this. Entrenching the democracy in Afghanistan is one of the best ways we can defend ourselves against extremism. And I think this is a very, very important set of commitments that have been made today to help us have much greater confidence that that is precisely what we can do now, as the Prime Minister said, between now and October. And I think the range of the commitments that people have brought to the table today are very significant. And I think they will allow us, as I say, to take another step forward in securing and defending the Afghanistan democracy. And that is a very, very important part of achieving overall campaign success in Afghanistan.
Just 2 or 3 more questions. Mina Shaikh-Al-Awsat.
John Huckman, the Associate Defence Secretary there, talking about overall operational success, to paraphrase what he was talking about. That's not necessarily a phrase that we've heard much of recently from various defence ministers involved in the countries who are in Afghanistan, because they're not quite sure what overall success would necessarily mean. We're going to talk to Donald Jensen, an expert on this particular area, and also formerly a diplomat and a resident fellow at Johns Hopkins. First things first, the French president saying that what Barack Obama wants mirrors what the Europeans have wanted for years. How come? When did that happen?
Well, I think there's been a lot of spin in the last day or two, and I think perhaps the French president overspoke a little bit. I think the Americans certainly have retargeted their goals and downsized them, but I don't think that's true to what I see as the historical and current
Okay.
reality.
So training, more training, that's the new troop numbers, because Barack Obama wanted more people on the ground. Is he having to accept the idea that that won't happen, but we will get involved in training people, local people?
I think the emphasis on the elections that Prime Minister Brown repeatedly said in his news conference is the key element, which is to say, I think this relatively optimistic rhetoric this weekend can be sustained, which means more than just training, probably, by most of the NATO allies through October. Beyond that, I'm very, very skeptical. We're talking about 3 to 5 years of very difficult military activity, and it's going to be much more than just training.
Okay, more than training specifically to do with what? Somebody was asking questions there about whether it would be soldiers at polling booths, for example.
I'm sure that will be the case. But it's also going to be soldiers, as Prime Minister Brown said, self-protection. The military situation is becoming more severe, more unstable, and that's going to inevitably draw the troops there away from whatever more pacification activities that they were originally assigned to do.
The key thing here being that Hamid Karzai thought he could go to an election in May. The Election Commission in Afghanistan said, no, hang on, the security situation simply doesn't hold that true. That is an impossibility, so therefore they had to go for August.
Yes. I would also, there is a contradiction ultimately, meaning beyond October, between some of the guarantees on human rights and other issues that Karzai faces domestically and simply staying in power and governing the country. And that's something that's going to be a very difficult choices that both sides, but in Kabul and in Brussels, will have to make in the coming months, because the situation is getting worse in Afghanistan, worse militarily, and the only way really to slow that deterioration down is to keep Karzai in power and have Karzai to some extent make deals with some of the regional leaders that remain very, very strong, especially in the south and southeast. Because
there is a widely held expectation that the violence, the level of violence, will increase during the summer months in the run-up to the election.
Yes, I think that's a reasonable expectation.
Okay. Now, moving on to this other line that we've had, the Danish Prime Minister Anders Fogh Rasmussen will be the next Secretary General. How does NATO change under him?
I don't think it changes substantially. I think the Turkish objection, let's call it, resistance, is very, very interesting, and it shows and illustrates the problems NATO faces in reorienting its mission and activities to an outside series of threats. If you go to your program today, we've seen issues of Pakistan, a possible terrorist incident in New York, nuclear non-proliferation in North Korea. All of these require NATO to think through again what its mission is and how to accomplish its mission. And there is, in large part, no solid agreement on what that should be.
So they still don't know what NATO is for?
There's a considerable amount of diversity within the organization about that. And I think what you're going to see, and I would watch carefully, is the other countries who have pledged today to beef up their commitment to Afghanistan, see what kind of conditions are there. As the Americans would say, where's the beef? Yeah. And I think, particularly with some countries, for example, Germany, I think the commitment is not likely to be as open-ended as the rhetoric today really suggests.
And yet Angela Merkel saying as well, the German Chancellor, she can go home very happy with the complex discussions that they've had in the past 36 hours or so, and yet she's saying on the one hand, yes, I realize we've got to step up to the plate, but on the other hand, that doesn't mean German forces in the southern half of Afghanistan.
That doesn't necessarily mean that. And she's got an election coming up too, and I think German domestic opinion is considerably resistant to a more active, more vigorous presence of German forces in Afghanistan.
Where does this leave Barack Obama's relationship with every other majorly important NATO country?
I think the good talk, the happy talk, as we would say, is important. The emphasis on the Washington consulting, jointly achieving our common goals, I think is important. He's a very charismatic guy, and that will, I think, allow him to go home with claiming success, both at the G20 and and the past day or two. I think it's my general impression that many people who were very critical of the Bush administration expected more change out of Washington than perhaps will likely be the case. The change will be in the issue of conciliation, working together, but I think a lot of the issues, for example, stability in Afghanistan, have not going to be changing that much.
Very briefly, marks out of 10 for the NATO summit.
Oh, I would give, for whom?
Everyone.
I would say 8 or 9 out of perfection. But again, where's the beef? I might change that next week. I would also mention in passing that Mr. Obama is going to Turkey in the next few days, and that will be a place where I'm sure this issue will be discussed again in the context of a generally worsening U.S. Relationship with Ankara.
He might mention his own name again, as he did just yesterday,
yes.
Barack Hussein Obama.
It works. Yes.
Donald Jensen, for the moment, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, as we were hearing there, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel welcomed the outcome of this NATO summit.
I can say that I'm gratified to know that NATO has proved here its capability to act. We have given the mandate to devise a new strategic concept. We agreed on an Afghanistan strategy. We are reviving the NATO-Russia Council. That has very important tasks to contend with, but there is no doubt at all in my mind that all of that would not have been sufficient to make this a successful summit meeting.
Well, the French President, Mr. Sarkozy, praised Barack Obama's input into his first NATO conference and reaffirmed the French support of America's new strategy for Afghanistan.
I would like to thank President Obama, who has made a strong commitment towards all of the decisions we've made. It was his first NATO summit.